My name is Mark Cannon, and this is the second part of the presentation from the Oxford University Control Group. The first part was given by Jana Liškova in her talk this morning. I'm very grateful to Ying and Gia for inviting me, and I'm sorry I can't be at the workshop in person today. I hope you find this talk useful and interesting, and if you have any unanswered questions, you're welcome to send me an email at this address. Starting with some motivation, here are some observations we can probably all agree on. So control applications with nonlinear dynamics are notoriously difficult, and they're made even harder by the presence of uncertainty in system models and by hard constraints on the states and control inputs. So the motivation for my research is really to find problem formulations that make these problems easier to solve. Here is the outline of my talk. I'll begin with a review of the tube MPC approach introduced in Jana's talk, where we use models expressed as differences of convex functions to derive convex approximations of optimal control problems. I'll then discuss how to construct models in the form of differences of convex functions using polynomial approximations and input convex neural networks. I'll then provide a few comments on tube geometry and its effect on computation before explaining how we introduce model uncertainty into our tube MPC approach. I then want to look at 3 example applications which highlight different aspects of our approach. These are disturbance handling, online parameter adaptation, and data-driven methods for multi-step model identification. So starting with a brief recap of MPC, this is a summary of the optimization problem that defines the model predictive control law. It involves minimizing some performance cost, subject to constraints which include the dynamics of the system and constraints on the system states and control inputs. At each discrete time step, we solve this optimization problem, and then we use the first element of the optimal sequence of controls to define the model predictive control law. And by repeating this optimization online, we obtain a feedback control law. Focusing on the model dynamics, if the system is nonlinear, then this function f will be nonlinear. And that means that this optimization problem is non-convex because we have an equality constraint here. So to relax this problem to obtain a convex approximation, we relax this equality constraint to an inequality constraint. So these inequality constraints, which are expressed here, define a tube or a sequence of sets that bound the predicted state trajectory. So now we predict and optimize over a tube, making this a tube MPC strategy. Otherwise, the basic formulation is the same. We solve this problem online at each time step, and we use the optimal solution, the first element of the optimal sequence, to define a predictive control law. So this relaxation to inequality constraints allows a convex approximation of the original nonlinear programming problem simply by linearizing any concave terms in these inequalities. So note that we're not linearizing all of the inequality, just the concave parts. The relaxation also allows us to introduce explicit handling of uncertainty in the system model in terms of disturbances or unknown parameters, provided we have bounds on these disturbances or unknown parameters. So here we are assuming that the tube is defined by parameters contained in this vector Q, and that the vertices of the sets defining the tube can be obtained as functions of this vector Q. So I'll say a bit more about the tube geometry later in this talk. So we use a version of the convex concave procedure to solve a sequence of convex problems at each time step. So focusing on the iteration that's solved at each time step. At each iteration, we use a linearization approach to remove the concave terms in the inequality constraints. We do this by linearizing around a solution estimate, which is obtained from the solution of the most recently computed iteration. So this solution estimate is obtained as a trajectory of the nonlinear system model, and we simply update this trajectory at each iteration, relinearize, resolve the optimization problem, and then this defines the sequence of optimization of convex optimization problems. So using the observation that the Jacobian linearization of a concave function is an upper bound on that function, the sequence of convex problems that we obtain from this process is necessarily feasible at each iteration. And it also converges to a local minimum of the original nonlinear programming problem. In addition, the iteration that we solve is necessarily feasible, and the optimal cost is non-increasing. And this allows guarantees of robust stability and constraint satisfaction for any choice of the maximum number of iterations that we solve at each time step. So even if we solve just one iteration per time step, we can guarantee recursive feasibility, and we get some guarantees of stability from the monotonically non-increasing cost. This part of the talk looks at how to obtain system models as differences of convex functions. It's an interesting and potentially quite surprising fact that any twice differentiable function can be expressed as a difference of two convex functions. And because of this, any continuous function can be approximated arbitrarily closely on a compact set by a difference of convex functions. But if you're given an arbitrary nonlinear function, it's not always obvious how to define a pair of convex functions whose difference is equal to that function or will approximate that function. So here we concentrate on two computational approaches. The first is based on polynomial approximation. We break this down into two stages. The first stage involves fitting a polynomial, and we fit a polynomial in a particular form given by this expression, where y is a monomial, vector of monomials in the independent variables, so this could consist of the states and control inputs, and f is a matrix that we want to find. So we find the best fit matrix f, for example, in a least squares sense, to samples of the function we're trying to approximate. In the second stage, we find matrices G and H such that f is equal to G minus H, and such that these two functions, y transpose gy and y transpose hy, are both convex. And we do that with constraints on the Hessian matrices of these functions. So we can express these conditions as semi-definite conditions on the matrices G and H. And as a result of this, we get a semi-definite programming problem to solve in order to determine G and H. Here is an example of the polynomial fitting approach applied to a Gaussian function in two variables. Here we fix the maximum degree of monomials to 4, and that gives us a representation of the functions G and H in terms of a pair of 15 by 15 matrices. So using 50 samples, we basically fit the functions f to the data, and then decompose f into these functions G and H, and we get this error map shown here. The second approach I want to discuss performs the DC decomposition using feed-forward or recurrent neural networks. So I'm going to focus on feed-forward neural networks, which consist of a sequence of layers of activation functions between which we have linear mappings. And we also have some feed-forward terms which again pass through linear mappings defined by these matrices phi. So the input-output map defined by this network is specified by the parameters, the network parameters, the matrices theta, phi, and the bias terms b. So we can constrain the input-output map to be convex in the input if the kernel weights, so these matrices theta, are all constrained to be non-negative, and if the activation functions are chosen to be convex and non-decreasing. So in fact, this is a very common situation in practice. So for example, the rectified linear unit activation function obviously has this property of being convex and non-decreasing. So this allows us to define something called an input convex neural network by putting constraints on the network parameters during the training process. We can construct a difference of convex function neural network, or DCNN, by constraining the network weights to be non-negative for all layers apart from the final layer, and then the final layer the weights are allowed to be free. And again, we apply these constraints during the training process. So DCNNs have some obvious advantages over polynomial approximations. First of all, they tend to be easier to train, and you can probably see that the process of constructing a difference of convex polynomial approximation by solving a semi-definite program quickly becomes very computationally intensive as the dimension of the state and control input grows, and as the number of monomials used to approximate the polynomial function increases. Secondly, DCNNs typically are much faster to evaluate because it simply consists of a sequence of activation functions interspersed by linear mappings. And finally, they're also generally faster to linearize. And again, we can do this by using a composition of Jacobians applying to each layer of the DCNN. I'm going to illustrate these two methods for deriving DC approximations by applying them to a very simple control problem. So the control problem is to control a quadcopter, and in fact we're only focusing on the planar dynamics of this quadcopter in these simulations. So we're interested in how it moves in the YZ plane, where Y is horizontal position and Z is vertical position. The model state has 6 elements, and we have these dynamics plus some integrators. There are 2 control inputs to the system, which represent the net thrust and the torque applied by the motors, both of which have magnitude constraints. And we also have constraints on the states of the system in terms of the pitch angle, rate of pitch angle change, and velocities in the Y and Z directions. So these plots show the approximation for the vertical dynamics that's obtained using a difference of convex polynomials, and you can see here the error plot that we get as a function of alpha and control input U1. So these plots show the DCNN approximation of the horizontal and vertical dynamics. So here we're using a neural network, a feed-forward neural network with ReLU activation functions and 2 hidden layers. And the error map that we get after training is shown here. And the main point, I think, is that the magnitude of the errors is similar to the error map that we had for the difference of convex polynomial approximation. The objective of the controller is to regulate the horizontal and vertical velocities and the pitch angle to 0. So we define an MPC strategy by choosing its cost as a quadratic cost, which penalizes deviations of these states from 0. And you can see the closed-loop responses of this MPC strategy in these plots with 3 different types of model approximation. So there's the 2 methods that I've just described, so the polynomial and the DCNN DC decomposition, plus a third method based on radial basis functions, where we train a radial basis function representation of the system dynamics and then decompose this into a pair of convex functions. The responses that we get from these 3 MPC strategies are quite similar in terms of performance, and you can see that because they all require about the same amount of time to regulate the states to a neighborhood of 0. Interestingly, the polynomial approximation gives us a different solution from the other two approximations. This is probably because it has converged to a different local minimum of the original NLP. And you can see that because of the different shapes of control input and response we get for vertical velocity. The next section of my talk provides some observations about how the geometry that's used in Tube MPC affects the computational requirements of the controller. So I'm going to compare some different methods of defining the tube in MPC, focusing on strategies which use successive convexification to define a sequence of convex problems that approximate the original nonlinear program. So the first approach I'm going to compare uses ellipsoidal sets to define the tube. So that means that the tube cross-section at time k is defined by these parameters z, which defines the center of the ellipsoidal set, and beta, which defines its scaling. So here I'm assuming that the shape of the ellipsoidal set is fixed, and that's fixed by this matrix V. So because these sets are ellipsoidal, I'm going to focus on an MPC strategy which uses full model linearization. So here I'm assuming that we linearize the system dynamics around a predicted nominal trajectory, and we use the resulting time-varying linear model to optimize an approximation to the original nonlinear program defining the control problem. So I'm thinking in particular about the strategy which was presented at the ECC this year, where we incorporated bounds on linearization errors to ensure robust constraint handling. Second approach I want to compare uses hyperrectangular tubes. So here the tube cross-sections are defined by bounds on the elements of the state vector. And here I'm going to assume that we have a difference of convex function model of our system dynamics, and we're only using partial linearization. So we're only linearizing the concave part of the constraints defining the tube recursion from one time step to the next. I'm also going to compare the effects of using a simplex to define the tube cross-section. So here the tube cross-section is defined by these constraints in terms of parameters which limit the lower bounds on the elements of the state vector, and this parameter alpha, which bounds this linear combination of states. And again, I'm going to consider partial linearization using a difference of convex function model of the system dynamics. This slide summarizes the key properties of these three MPC strategies. First of all, in terms of the constraints which define reachable set bounds, for ellipsoidal tubes, these can be formulated as second-order cone constraints, whereas for hyperrectangular and simplex tubes, it depends on the form of DC model approximation that you're using. So if you have a polynomial DC model representation, these will be convex polynomial constraints, whereas if you have a DC neural network model representation with ReLU activation functions, these will be piecewise linear constraints. In terms of the handling of linearization errors, for the ellipsoidal tube MPC, where we have full linearization, we need to have explicit bounds on those linearization errors. So for example, we may need to bound the Jacobian of the nonlinear system model over some region of the state space, and if we need to compute these bounds online, then that can add significantly to the computational burden of the algorithm. On the other hand, the hyperrectangular and simplex tube MPC, which use difference of convex function model representations, don't require explicit bounds on linearization errors. So the errors are handled implicitly because we're only linearizing the concave parts of the system model. In terms of the number of points we need to consider when we are defining robust constraints, For ellipsoidal tubes, this number depends linearly on the horizon and the number of uncertain parameters in the system model. Similarly, for the simplex tube, it depends linearly on the horizon, a number of parameters, and also linearly on the state dimension. But for hyperrectangular tubes, the dependence on the state dimension becomes exponential. For the case where we have no additive disturbance and no model approximation error, the ellipsoidal tube MPC approach can still have some residual suboptimality. So even if you perform an infinite number of iterations, successively linearizing the dynamics, solving the resulting approximation, and then relinearizing, you can end up with convergence to a suboptimal solution, depending on how the linearization errors are handled. On the other hand, the hyperrectangular and simplex approach, which use DC model representations, there's no residual suboptimality, meaning that the algorithm converges to at least a local minimum for the original NLP. In terms of convergence rates, the ellipsoidal tube MPC approach can be slow, again depending on how the linearization errors are handled. Comparing the hyperrectangular and simplex approach, typically the hyperrectangular tube approach has much faster convergence than the simplex approach, especially if the state dimension is large, and that's because the tube gives you a more efficient bound on the reachable sets for the states. Finally, the ellipsoidal tube approach is not generally well suited to data-driven models, whereas the DC approximation method can be extended quite easily to data-driven modeling, and I'll explain more about this later in the talk. And finally, all three approaches can handle online parameter adaptation. To illustrate how the choice of different tube geometries affects computation, I'm going to present some results from Monte Carlo simulations of systems with different sizes. So all of the system models have this general form. It's basically some linear terms plus a quadratic term. And the system parameters here are all generated randomly for each simulation. So we're going to compare the ellipsoidal tube MPC with full linearization and explicit error bounds with a DC tube MPC approach with hyperrectangular and simplex tube cross sections. So the choice of nonlinearity here is important because it means that the DC tube MPC approach can be formulated using the same type of constraints as the ellipsoidal tube MPC. So the constraints which define the reachable sets here are expressed as second order cone constraints in all three cases. These plots show how the computation per iteration of each of these three MPC schemes depends on problem size in terms of the number of states and the number of uncertain parameters in the system model. And you can see here this plot showing the time per iteration, that the dependence on problem size for a hyperrectangular tube is, as expected, exponential, whereas it's actually polynomial for the ellipsoidal tube and simplex tube approaches. And the reason for this is that the main factor contributing to computation here is the number of second order cone constraints, which is roughly the same for the ellipsoid and simplex tube approaches, whereas it grows exponentially with problem size for the hyperrectangular approach. The computation times shown on the previous slide were obtained using the solver Gurobi. And the conclusions to make from this are that hyperrectangular tube MPC combines well with DC models, provided the state dimension is relatively small. So provided we have, say, 5 states or fewer, then using this computational setup, we can solve each iteration easily within about a second, whereas the computation required grows very quickly with a number of states, and for larger numbers of states, it's worth using a different tube geometry, so for example simplex tubes, which allow you much better scalability with problem size. In the next section of this talk, I'm going to return to the problem formulation and explain how we can incorporate explicit disturbance handling in the MPC strategy. So I'm assuming that we have additive disturbances affecting the system model, and we have bounds on these disturbances. We need to use the bounds on the disturbances to modify the constraints that define the tube bounding the reachable sets for our predicted states. So we can ensure robust constraint satisfaction if we consider the worst case effect of the disturbance on these constraints. So I've simply replaced the disturbance by an upper bound based on the bounds that are available on the disturbance set. We also need to modify the terminal set for the algorithm and its terminal cost. These can be done using standard techniques from the MPC literature, so I won't go into this in any more detail. So the robust MPC strategy that we obtain with this explicit method of handling disturbances looks very similar to the strategy we had when we had no disturbances. In particular, at each time step, we solve a sequence of convex problems which are obtained by linearizing the concave parts of the system dynamics. So focusing on this iteration, which is defined here, at each iteration we are using a trajectory of the nominal system model, that is with disturbances set to nominal values and any unknown parameters also set to the nominal values. And we use this nominal trajectory to define linearization points for the concave parts of the nonlinear dynamics. There is an important difference here between this robust MPC approach and the approach when there are no disturbances. And this is that for the robust case, we can't guarantee the recursive feasibility of these iterations. In particular, because we are linearizing around a nominal trajectory, we can't guarantee that the constraints we get in the convexified problem will necessarily be feasible, even if the trajectory itself was feasible for the problem constraints. Each iteration at each discrete time step starts with linearizing the concave model component around a nominal trajectory. We continue to iterate until the change in the control sequence is small enough or the maximum number of iterations is reached. But if the convex subproblem is infeasible, then we use a line search approach to update the linearization trajectory. So in this case, we keep a copy of a previous nominal model trajectory, which we know generates a feasible set of constraints. And we're simply using a backtracking line search that returns to this copy of the nominal trajectory if necessary, in order to generate a feasible optimization problem. And so this approach actually recovers feasibility using line search based on a previous nominal trajectory that we know will generate a feasible set of constraints. The next section of this talk will describe 3 applications which illustrate different aspects of the DC tube MPC strategy. I'm going to start with an application to trajectory optimization for vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. So the picture you can see here is of an electric VTOL prototype aircraft that's been developed by Rolls-Royce. The idea is that these will facilitate urban mobility by replacing, for example, taxi journeys. And the aim is to reduce congestion and air pollution, particularly in cities. So they're designed to do short journeys of maybe 15-20 minutes carrying passengers. So it's envisaged that in the future there will be many of these aircraft taking off and landing from relatively small regions within cities. And this poses some very particular control challenges. Firstly, it's expected that the control of these will be highly automated, and the coordination of multiple vehicles will also be coordinated. I'm going to focus on the trajectory optimization part of the problem, which is looking at an individual aircraft. And the challenges here are that the aircraft dynamics are highly nonlinear as it transitions from vertical to horizontal flight and back again to vertical flight. And secondly, that we have very stringent safety constraints on this, the operation of this aircraft. This is a tilt-wing VTOL aircraft, meaning that its wings and in fact also its tail can change their orientation. This allows the propellers to provide vertical thrust when they're pointing upwards and horizontal thrust when they're oriented horizontally. This makes the horizontal flight more efficient, but it actually considerably complicates the control problem because the wing goes through a stall condition as it rotates from vertical to horizontal and back again. So the control problem is to track a reference trajectory during a forward and backward transition maneuver, subject to constraints on states and control inputs, model uncertainty, and unknown disturbances in the form of wind gusts. We use a planar model of the aircraft dynamics, which describes its motion in the XZ plane, where X is horizontal position and Z is vertical position. The model is sixth order, and it describes how the horizontal and vertical accelerations depend on thrust, drag, and lift forces, and also on these unknown disturbances which represent the effects of wind gusts. The model state IW here represents the angle of the wing. Alpha is the angle of attack of the wing, and gamma is the angle of the flight path relative to horizontal. To model the lift and drag forces acting on the wing, we introduce an effective angle of attack that applies to the parts of the wing which have air blown over them by the propeller. So we use a simplification where we split the wing into a part where the blown angle of attack is important and a part where the angle of attack is defined by the angle of the wing and the motion of the aircraft. So the lift and drag forces are given by these two expressions, and here these CL and CD are the lift and drag coefficients as functions of these angles of attack. The lift and drag coefficients are modeled by the curves shown in these plots as a function of the angles of attack. These could be obtained from directly from data, for example, from experiments with the wing in a wind tunnel. Here we're assuming a particular wing cross-section and using the Tangular Ostawari postal model to define these curves. The control problem has bounded disturbances and constraints on states and control inputs. So we're assuming that we know bounds on these disturbances, and these bounds could come from, for example, limits on the variation in wind speed that we would expect given the prevailing weather conditions. The bounds on the states are largely there for safety reasons and to try to prevent stall. The bounds on the control inputs are due to actuator limits. We apply the DC decomposition approach to the system dynamics, and here we're using the polynomial approximation method to provide the DC decomposition for the X and the Z dynamics. The controller is parameterized as a two-term controller with a feedback term which involves feedback gains that are computed offline, multiplying the errors in the states relative to the desired reference trajectory. And added to this are perturbations which are optimized in the online MPC optimization. This slide gives an idea of the accuracy of the DC approximation to the nonlinear dynamics. So it shows the result of fitting a polynomial using least squares to the nonlinear dynamics, and then the error that we get as a result of this least squares fit. These plots show the simulations of the forward transition for the case where there are no disturbances, so no wind gusts. The aim here is to keep the aircraft at constant altitude during the transition, and you can see that the controller achieves this very well. The relative altitude remains at 0 throughout the transition, and you can see that the transition is happening because of the change in angle of the wing down to 0, meaning that it's eventually going to end up in horizontal flight. We can also account explicitly for disturbances in the form of wind gusts. And in order to meet the regulatory requirements, we have to be able to withstand wind gusts with a certain profile. And the profile is shown in this plot here. So you can think of this as being a kind of a tube of wind that's gusting at a particular velocity in the center of the tube, and the aircraft is passing through this tube during its transition. So you can see the effects here of gusts occurring at initial time and 5 seconds into the transition. So in particular, the effect on the vertical velocity is quite severe, but we actually return fairly quickly to the required 0 vertical velocity, despite the effect of wind gusts happening at 0 and at 5 seconds. Overall, robust constraint satisfaction is validated under wind gusts occurring at any position in time during the forward and backward transitions. The next example I want to consider is an application of adaptive MPC to batch-fed bioreactor control. So in this application, we want to grow a batch of microorganisms, typically bacteria, and these are genetically engineered to produce some product, which could be a drug, penicillin for example, or it could be synthetic plastics or synthetic fuels. This can be quite a challenging control problem because the dynamics are often nonlinear and they often have uncertain parameters. So even though the structure of the nonlinear dynamics is fairly well understood, variations between individual batches of these microorganisms result in uncertain parameters within these models. So the aim is to maximize product formation and to actually also at the same time estimate the model parameters. So we're going to consider a simple 4-state model. So this is a model assuming perfect mixing. The states here represent the concentrations of cells, concentration of product, and substrate concentration, plus the volume of material within the batch. The control input is univariate here. We can control the feed flow of some feedstock, which is substrate at concentration Si, and we want to maximize this variable P at the end of some fixed horizon of say T time steps. So the continuous time dynamics are given by these expressions. So we have 4th order model with nonlinearities within it. We also have some unknown parameters. So the ones I'm going to focus on are this parameter, which represents the yield coefficient of biomass per substrate. So this is basically how much stuff your microorganisms are producing as a function of how much food is available to it at any given time. And the other variable is Si here, which is the inlet substrate concentration. So that's the concentration of feedstock at the inlet to the process. In this application, we're using a fairly standard set membership estimation scheme to estimate the parameters. So what this does is it estimates a set which bounds the unknown system parameters, and it applies to systems in which the unknown parameters appear linearly in the system model. So we first reformulate the parameters so that they appear linearly in the system dynamics. Then we obtain DC decompositions for the part of the model which doesn't depend on the parameters, and then another DC decomposition of the part which does depend on the parameters. So this lowercase and uppercase f each has a DC model approximation, which we obtain using a DC neural network representation. The set membership estimation scheme involves constructing an unfalsified parameter set at each time step. So this basically consists of all the possible values that the parameters could take, given the current state measurement or estimate, and given the bounds on the disturbance. And then we update our estimate of the parameter set by taking the intersection of our current parameter estimate set with this unfalsified set. And in this application, we want to ensure that the number of vertices of our uncertain parameter set remains constant, so we don't have a growth in computation over time. So the parameter set is actually defined by a polytopic set where the face normals are fixed and the scalings of the faces are updated online through this optimization. In this application, we are using a pair of DC neural networks with ReLU activation functions, and these are trained using a combination of experimental data for similar biological batch reactors and phenomenological models. These plots show the predicted trajectories at initial time, and basically you can see the sequence of predicted trajectories that we get at successive iterations of the algorithm. So here we're using, I think, 10 iterations at each time step. These plots show the parameter estimation convergence on the left-hand side and the closed-loop response of the predictive control scheme on the right-hand side. And the important point here is that we get about a third improvement in yield due to parameter estimation. As a final example, I'm going to describe briefly the application of MPC to deep brain stimulation, which is a treatment for Parkinson's disease and essential tremor. This involves implanting electrodes deep into patients' brains and using electrical pulses injected into their brains to disrupt pathological brain behavior, which can cause tremor. So the aim of the controller is to reduce the effects of stimulations with minimal levels of stimulation. And we want to do this by using measurements at the electrodes of pathological brain behavior, which is characterized by oscillations in voltage at a particular frequency. We have quite a large amount of data available to construct data-driven models for a population of patients, but we only have small amounts of data for individual patients. The current status of this project is we have a linear MPC strategy which has been validated in simulation and is about to be used, about to be tested on actual patients. And we are currently testing a nonlinear MPC based on difference of convex neural networks in simulation. So the control problem can be expressed like this. We are trying to minimize a measure of the beta oscillations above some threshold, and we have constraints on the control inputs and the rate of change of control parameters. For this application, we use a multi-step predictor model. So we use a different model for each prediction, a certain number of steps into the future. And for each of these models, we obtain a difference of convex function representation using input convex, a pair of input convex neural networks trained on observed patient responses. And we estimate disturbance bounds in our model using samples and estimates of measurement noise. So the justification for using multi-step prediction models is really given on this slide here, where you can see that we get a much better prediction accuracy using the multi-step model compared with the recursive model, either using a linear model or using a recursive nonlinear model. This slide illustrates closed-loop control performance. We're comparing here the DC-NN tube MPC with a linear MPC strategy, and also with PI control and an on-off switching strategy. The black line shows the nominal response when no control is applied. So the DC-NN tube MPC provides significantly better beta suppression than all the other controllers. And at the same time, it requires less stimulation energy than linear MPC, as well as than the PI controller and the on-off controller. And this is basically a result of the more accurate model of the patient response that's built into the DC-NN model representation. This slide compares the performance of controllers which are trained in two different methods. So the first method uses data from 3 patients to derive a difference of convex neural network model, which is then used in a model predictive controller applied to a 4th patient. The second method refines the pre-trained model, including data from the 4th patient. So when we apply both these controllers to the 4th patient, you can see that the refined model, as is to be expected, performs slightly better in this plot in terms of beta suppression. Probably more importantly, over a wide range of conditions, the refined model gives us, in general, much better performance than the pre-trained model. But the pre-trained model still performs better, on average, than linear MPC, proportional integral feedback, or the on-off control. This brings me to the end of my talk. Some summarizing comments. We have been looking at difference of convex function model representations in model predictive control. In particular, how we can use these to define a sequence of convex optimization problems which converge to a good approximation of the solution of the original nonlinear program, and how we can use data-driven methods to construct these difference of convex models using polynomials and difference of convex neural networks. I've given some examples of applications of DCT-MPC and shown that it has some nice properties in terms of disturbance handling, ability to cope with parameter adaptation, and data-driven models. And our ongoing work is to extend the work that we've been doing on biomedical applications and bioprocess control in particular, but also looking at other applications in aerospace. The material in this talk is based on these references, all of which are available online, and I'd be very happy to address any questions you have by email.